All right, welcome everyone who's online and in person today. I am very excited to introduce Dr. Nidhi Kalra, who is a senior information scientist at the RAND Corporation. Her research focuses on how organizations make robust decisions in the face of deep uncertainty, primarily with applications in climate change, autonomous vehicle policy, water resource management, and energy policy. In addition to her work at RAND, she is currently the vice president of the Society for Decision-Making Under Deep Uncertainty and an appointed commissioner for California 100, a statewide initiative focused on inspiring a vision and strategy for California's next century. Previously, she was a senior technology policy advisor to then US Senator Kamala Harris and a senior decision scientist in the Office of the chief economist of sustainable development at the World Bank. Most excitingly, I think, Nidhi is a Robo grad who earned her Ph.D. in robotics from CMU in the year 2006 with a dissertation entitled Hoplites, a market-based framework for planned tight coordination in multi-robot teams. I don't think we'll be hearing a lot about that, but she will be talking to you about her abundant experience regarding what you can do out in the world with an RI degree that is in robotics. So please, thank you. Take it away.
Thank you so much. I want to say I'm just so happy to be here. It's been 20 years, almost exactly 20 years ago that I started my PhD. I have not been to Pittsburgh in a long time. I'm glad to see the lecture hall looking exactly as it used to look. So a little context. As I say, I started 20 years ago, straight out of a computer science undergrad. And Tony Stentz, my advisor, was fantastic. And Tony is retiring this year, so congratulations to Tony. He was fantastic and guided me through my thesis on market-based multi-robot coordination. And by any means, everything was going fantastically. Like my proposal was great. I was going to conferences, I was publishing, everything was fantastic. And yet about halfway through my degree, I was struggling. I felt confused, I felt afraid, and I felt alone because I had this persistent feeling that I didn't want to build or work on robots for my career. And I didn't think I was passionate about it. So what the heck was I doing at the RI? I actually wanted to work on energy, environment, and climate change, sort of what I thought of as the existential problems of our time. I continue to think of them this way. And I felt like this was really unacceptable thoughts. If somebody found out I would be frog marched out of the RI, how dare I take up someone else's space who loves robots? This was a hard place to be. Now, 20 years later, I have that PhD in robotics, and I think being at the RI was one of the best things that ever happened to me, that I ever did. It is instrumental in enabling me to work on these other problems. I'm going to skip to the end in my talk. I'm going to right now talk about the work I do and get into some technical details. And then I'm going to come back to how I got from there, which is kind of a depressed robotics student, to here, which is kind of a depressed climate researcher, but a different kind of depressed, and it's a good depressed. And and then come back to what you might be able to do if you have inclinations to go broader and take a different path. So let me pull up my presentation and share my screen. And this is a bit of an intimate crowd, even though we're on Zoom. I really don't mind taking questions in the middle. If someone would moderate, if there's questions people want to raise their hands or put them in the chat, because I can't really see them right now, I'm perfectly happy to take questions and be interrupted. So that's the title of my talk. What else can you do with a robotics degree? The short answer is a lot. So at the end of this talk, my hope is that you will first have some ideas of what else you can do with a robotics degree. Understand why having a robotics degree can be a tremendous asset in those other fields. I want to share with you and help you understand some steps you could take to get on that alternative off the beaten path, and talk about some of the costs and benefits of doing so, because it's mostly roses, but not all roses. So I work at the RAND Corporation. RAND is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution. We do research on public policy, all kinds of public policy, with the aim that we can have better government policies if they are based on good evidence, good research. So here's some of the questions that RAND tackles. One, how could the US military counter extremism in its ranks? These are titles of actual projects, actual recent projects. How risky is it to hire people with criminal histories? How do we reach carbon neutrality by 2050? And what are the costs and benefits of doing so? What policy changes could help save lives from illicit synthetic opioid overdoses? How do different gun policies affect gun use, homicides, suicides, hunting participation, and other outcomes? And how many miles of test driving would it take to prove autonomous vehicle safety? Today, I'm going to share two of my areas of work on this, one in criminal justice reform and the other in climate change, although this business with test driving is also my work. So let's start off with a project that I recently finished on understanding recidivism risk with my excellent colleagues, Sean Bushway, Brian Vegetable. So assessing risk, criminal risk of recidivism really matters. So some 30% of Americans have a criminal history and they get it pretty young. And people with criminal histories face thousands of restrictions at every level of government on how they can participate in life, where they might be able to live, what kind of jobs they can get, what kind of licensure, even college. And if we're going to exclude people from participating fully in society, it had better be based on good evidence and good estimates of what the trade-offs are of doing so, because getting this wrong can be really costly. Of course, it is very problematic for people who are restricted from opportunity. It affects their life outcomes. It also makes it harder to desist if you can't get a job. For employers, it means that they have a smaller labor pool to choose from. And for society, we spend billions and billions of dollars on our criminal justice system. So we're investing a lot in the system. We should really understand how it works. And the problems only ripple out from there. We have huge income inequality in the country. And there's tremendous racial injustice and racial bias in the criminal justice system. So this is a very serious problem of how we understand how people who have criminal histories can participate fully in civic life. So pop quiz for you, and I'm going to give you a legit minute to think about it. Which of these statements is true? A, 2/3 of people return to prison within 5 years of their release. Or B, 2/3 of people who have been to prison never return to prison. I'm going to give you a minute so you can shade in your answer. Okay. Well, the Bureau of Justice Statistics is a federal organization that tracks recidivism data. They ask the question, how often do people who are released from prison return? A is true. 2/3 of people return to prison within 5 years of their release. And this fact fuels the view that people with criminal histories are high risk, that we need to do background checks on everybody for almost everything to make sure that we are hiring or employing or lending to people who are low risk, who aren't going to recidivate and commit a crime for which an employer would be held responsible. So the issue is that while the fact A is true, that interpretation I just gave you is false, because the way the criminal justice system understands recidivism has a sampling bias, because the cohort of people who are released from prison in any given year is more likely to have higher recidivists than the general population. If we count a person each time they're released from prison, the people who treat prison like a revolving door make it look like a revolving door. So there's a sampling bias problem. It's like an airline asking if how often do people fly? How often does our customer base fly? But if they only survey people getting off of any given flight, they're going to disproportionately survey their most frequent flyers. So when we remove that sampling bias towards frequent recidivists and sample the entire population who's ever been to prison, the fact B is true. Also, 2/3 of people who have ever been to prison, in fact, never return. Most people who have gone to prison do not commit another crime. They desist from returning to prison. So we've got this puzzle, which is that we understand prison to be a revolving door, but in fact, most people in society never recidivate. And the problem is a mismatch between the sample in the first question and the interpretation in the second. There's a second puzzle. People's risk of recidivating changes over time. It is a fact that crime is a young person's game, and people are most likely to commit crimes when they're young. And they age out of committing crimes as they get older. People also commit fewer crimes the longer they spend time in the community. This is partly because if you've managed to spend time in the community without recidivating, you've probably found some social support, you've found an alternative path. These two facts, that most people desist and that people's risk of recidivating changes over time, is in sharp contrast to those restrictions I described earlier, where people with criminal histories are prohibited from getting certain licenses, prohibited from life opportunities. So we've got a problem, and that's what we're looking at in this project. So let's take an example. Here's two fictional individuals. We're asking the question, who will recidivate sooner after they're released? We've got Adam, A, and Ben, B. They were the same age at their first conviction, 18. Their last conviction was at 27. They've both been convicted of felonies and that have led to incarceration. Adam has 6 priors. Ben has 2. Intuitively, you might say, well, Adam seems like a riskier person. We can understand this as the question the criminal justice system is asking. Someone gets convicted, let's say they are incarcerated, and then they're released. And the criminal justice system wants to know, what's a person's risk of recidivating at the time of release? And this is a totally valid and legitimate question, which is how well is our system working in keeping you out of prison? We can understand this mathematically using survival curves. So you see this in medicine a lot. A survival curve shows the likelihood of surviving at any given point or at some time after a diagnosis. So the curve will be different for different kinds of cancers and heart disease. The question is, what fraction or what percent of people survive X years after receiving a diagnosis? We can use this to understand the probability of reoffending, because what we're asking is, what is the likelihood of remaining conviction-free, again, surviving in the community, sometime after release? And based on data of people who look like Adam and Ben, or not look like, but have the histories of Adam and Ben, we can say that Adam's 6 priors suggest he has a lower likelihood of survival, of remaining conviction-free after his release. We can compare both Ben and Adam, let's say 2 years after they're each released, and see that Ben has some 70% chance of survival, whereas Adam only has a 50% chance of survival. But this is not what employers are asking. Employers encounter people sometime after their release, sometimes months, years after their release, when they do a background check. And an employer wants to know, how likely is a person to recidivate in the future? Unfortunately, that question is answered by asking, how likely were they to recidivate when they were released? And this is what we're trying to change. So let's say we knew that Adam has spent 4 years in the community without a next conviction, and Ben has spent 1 year in the community without a new conviction. What do we do with this information? Who should an employer hire? This is where our project and our research introduced the reset principle, which might actually sound pretty obvious to all of you, but a risk prediction model has to be updated, reset at the time of the background check. Basically, our risk estimate has to be at the moment at which the question is being asked and not at some time in the past. So how did we do this? Conceptually, it's simple. Mathematically, it's hard. So first, you take the survival curve and you have to update survival to demonstrate 100% survival between release and background check. because we know the person didn't recidivate in that time. So for Adam, the curve is moved up to 100% after 4 years. And for Ben, it's 100% after 1 year. Then the question is, how likely are they to recidivate in the future? So we have to actually realign these curves to T equals time of background check. And what we find is that because Adam has spent so long in the community without a new conviction, his likelihood of recidivating is actually in the near term indistinguishable from Ben's. And in fact, over the long term, Adam may actually be a safer person to hire than Ben. Now, these are totally fictional characters, but the point is, if you do the math wrong, we can actually prevent people from having the very life opportunities they need to get on a different path. So here are the takeaways of this research. First, people change. People can and do change from being high risk to low risk. And better assessment can show us when this occurs. We can witness and observe change. And if we can identify change, there's hope to create better policies around how we reintegrate people with criminal histories into communities. Now, how did we do this? When I give this talk to criminal justice audiences, we get to say, we did some machine learning on the problem. And I don't think that's going to fly here. So we used a mixture of survival experts models. So it's pretty straightforward in that we created a bunch of experts based on Weibull distributions and based on covariates of each covariates associated with each criminal history. And then we used a neural network to estimate the expert weights for each expert in determining what the risk is. So let me pause for a second. Are there any questions on this work?
I have a slightly philosophical question, but maybe I can save it for after the.
No, go ahead. I think we've got time.
So my question is, so this seems like really well thought out. I'm like curious how easy you find it to convince potential employers of this research and tell them that their current like mode of hiring is perhaps inaccurate and they should be factoring these in, because that's not something I imagine an employer sort of naturally does.
You know, you'd be surprised. We happen to be at a unique time in sort of criminal justice history or views, which is that there's a lot of employers actually looking to hire people with criminal histories. The tide has turned. I think with Ban the Box and other policy interventions, recognizing the racial disparities, I think we are seeing a desire on the behalf of employers to change how they think about people with criminal histories. But rather than going from one sort of intuition, in this case, false intuition about people with criminal histories to another, we're suggesting that we can have an evidence-based approach. The second thing is we're not directly convincing employers. We actually have to speak to, and we have spoken to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which sets rules on how people are treated with respect to criminal histories. So a lot of employers actually just want to avoid getting in trouble. And so if we can convince the EEOC to clarify their rules around criminal histories to be responsive to this data, that is a good way. That is an indirect way of changing employers' minds. And at our last workshop, we had the chairperson, the chairwoman of the EEOC attend, along with a whole lot of other prominent officials who are very interested in changing policy, but wanting to do so in an evidence-based way.
Cool.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I had one question about this. So one part was, I guess the training for the weighting happens based on some features about the individual in this case. And do you have problems with bias in the data where just because certain data points occur or certain features occur more, that leads to a worse prediction of survival rates? And have you looked at how to deal with those problems?
So this work is ongoing. So that is one of the things we recognize as a critical next step, which is that if you have underlying bias data that is racially disparate, you will have predictions that are racially disparate, for example. So we've not solved this problem, but we are aware that it exists. Right now, in the way that criminal histories are viewed, that is implicit, and there's no accounting for it. So the hope and expectation is that if we make those racial differences explicit, that we will be able to do something about it, but we're not there yet. So this is the start of a long trajectory of work.
Thank you.
Let me talk about climate change now, totally switching gears. I've been working for the last over a year on, right now almost my entire portfolio is on climate change. This question looks at how we decarbonize the economies of every country in Latin America and the Caribbean, with excellent colleagues at Tec de Monterrey in Mexico, other colleagues at RAND, and at the Inter-American Development Bank, which is like the World Bank, but for Latin America. So holding, the Paris Agreement, which many of you may have heard about, seeks to hold the increase in global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees C and as close to 1.5 degrees C as possible. Pop quiz for you. How much do we need to reduce carbon emissions to reach this goal? I'll give you a minute to think about it. By what percentage? 10%, 20, 50? What percent? Okay, hold your answers in your mind. You are right if you guessed 100%. There is no room for error here. Science makes it clear that in order to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees C, we have to reduce carbon dioxide emissions completely. We have to eliminate them or make them net zero. Otherwise, we will overshoot this. The 1.5 degrees will be off the table. And we have to do it by 2050. This is what you're looking at here, is we have to cross the zero line in a mere 30 years. So how do we do this? That's the question of our project. There's some challenges. You won't be surprised to hear. One is that change is not the right word. Transformations are required in every sector: agriculture, land use, transportation, electricity, waste, industrial processes, buildings. Every part of our economy has to transform. So this is just a huge multi-sectoral problem. Two is, how do we get decision makers to decarbonize? When a country makes its decarbonization plans, it's usually like the equivalent of the Ministry of the Environment or Natural Resources, the EPA, that's making these rules. But it's the Minister of Transportation, so I'm using Latin American vocabulary here, the Department of Transportation, Health and Human Services, that's concerned with congestion and throughput, that's concerned with air quality and asthma, and of course cost, right? The utility sector wants what is cheapest. So how do we get, these other sectors are sympathetic towards climate goals, but it's not their bottom line. So the second challenge of our project is to speak to these decision makers about climate change in terms that matter to them. What is the effect of combating climate change on air quality, on cost, on transportation efficiency and safety? So these are the costs and benefits. The third challenge is deep uncertainty. We can't predict the future accurately. And I'll give you a couple of examples. What we're seeing here are predictions, historical predictions of the International Energy Agency's predictions of how many gigawatts of added capacity of solar are going to be in place. Each of these colored lines represents a prediction according to when it was made, and the black line reflects what actually happened. And the takeaway here is that not only were they wrong, they were grossly wrong every time and made the same kinds of errors in prediction every time, always imagining that PV will now start being deployed somewhat linearly, when in fact it has been exponential growth. Just another example of what we call deep uncertainty. Japan, for example, has been making, every country, but Japan has been making predictions about its fertility rate for decades. And every time it is way too optimistic. So you'll see forecasts in blue and the actual rate in black. And every time there's a sense that, oh, our fertility rate dropped, but it's just going to increase. Oh, it dropped, but it's still going to increase. Swear it's going up. Swear it's going up. And it has been dropping precipitously. This is not a problem with people. It's a problem with predictions. Prediction making is extremely difficult. In a minute, you're going to see me make some predictions. But we have to manage deep uncertainty. We have to come up with solutions that are robust to the many things we can't predict. And this is the field I work in, decision-making under deep uncertainty. Deep uncertainty exists when people can't assign probabilities to future outcomes, or they disagree too much on what the outcomes should be valued at, or there's a sense that we don't understand how the model works. So any probabilistic approach to the problem falls apart. We answer this by first engaging with stakeholders to include a broad range of policy objectives, and then simulating, when we have quantitative analyses, huge numbers of possible futures and the policy options, not to make predictions, but to actually identify options that are robust. Those options that satisfy multiple objectives across many futures and therefore can be taken without first needing to make accurate predictions. So how are we doing this project? We started, we're still in the process of it, we're quite halfway through, with an intense modeling effort that implements the entire IPCC methodology for bottom-up national greenhouse gas inventory accounting. So like all 5 volumes and thousands of pages. It's a huge modeling effort. Then we have to get data from every sector in every country in Latin America and use that to calibrate our model and then make future estimates of what could happen. And because we're not making a single projection, we're running through thousands of simulations. We have to use efficient sampling to explore across our uncertainty space. And then we use data mining techniques, simple algorithms, really, patient rule induction method, to find solutions that are robust. Our modeling architecture looks like this. So we have this implementation model of 4 different super sectors: agriculture, forestry, livestock, and other land use, which I'll talk about today; circular economy, which is solid and liquid waste; industrial processes; non-electricity energy use; and then a huge electricity model. Into this, we put in what we would say are sectoral transformations and uncertainties about the effects of those transformations. And the model tells us what are the emissions, what are the costs, what are the benefits, and what's the macroeconomic impact of those transformations under the uncertainties. So today, I just want to look at a piece of this, the transformations in agriculture and forestry in terms of emissions. So let me switch over to some live data demonstration, which is always dangerous. Okay, so this is a piece of our analysis, as you can see. What you're looking at here is the production of is agricultural production, agricultural output. On the top, we have yields of crops for every country aggregated in Latin America by crop type. So sugarcane is a massive output of all of Latin America. And the bottom, we have the head of livestock. So we have right now about 1 billion head of livestock in Latin America, vast majority of which is dairy and non-dairy cattle. And we project this out in the future to increase, almost double, for 2 reasons. One is productivity will increase, so you can have more sugarcane per acre than you did before. And 2, demand for these products is increasing. This is not our only projection. This is just one to illustrate the point. Now, all this agricultural activity requires land. So we can turn to our model to see how much land is this going to require. And what you'll see, not surprisingly, is that our forests will have to shrink. Forests are going to be cut down for grassland, cropland, pasture land. And here you see cropland and grassland increasing. And now let's look at emissions. What does this world of emissions look like? I'm going to start with a baseline projection, which is that emissions are set to double. So on the horizontal axis, we have time. The vertical axis, we have how many millions of tons of CO2 equivalent are emitted. And the colored bands indicate the source. So let me walk through the sources. First, agricultural activity is an emitter. The agricultural production, the soil tilling, rice production releases a lot of methane. Then we've got a whole lot from livestock from 2 sources. A small one is from livestock manure. Basically, manure emits a lot of N2O, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And enteric fermentation, which is a euphemism for cow farts and cow burps. Enteric fermentation is basically ruminants like sheep and buffalo that emit a lot of methane biologically. And there's a huge amount of that in the sector. There's another massive emissions from land use conversion, because to grow more crops or have more livestock, we have to cut down those forests. And there's a lot of carbon stock in those forests that is then lost as we deforest. There are some emissions that come from the soil itself as it's tilled, as activity occurs on it. Meanwhile, we have the forests, which as they grow are a sink. So the carbon that's absorbed by forests every year offsets the emissions that you see. So any questions here? I know there's a lot happening. Oops, a lot happening on this chart. No, okay. I don't know how to make this. There we go. So what we asked is, okay, what can be done? How can the AFOLU sector be decarbonized? A popular and attractive idea is, can we raise our livestock and grow our crops better in a more technologically advanced way? So I'm going to show you the effect of things like improved rice management, improved fertilizer use, like reducing fertilizer losses, more efficient application, vaccinating cows against enteric fermentation, and doing a host of other things to the way we grow crops. And it has an effect, but it is modest. Our goal is to get to net zero, and this effect is not going to get us there. These technologies aren't going to get us there. We can't, in this sector, get to net zero by growing and raising things better, partly because simply of biology. So then we ask the question, okay, what comes next? We know that conversion of land use is a really big deal. What if Latin America were to implement a policy that says no more cutting down forests, forests stay as they are? This has two effects. One is you're not doing that land use conversion. Two is we're actually shrinking the amount of crops that we grow implicitly and how much livestock, because we don't have as much land as we did before. This helps quite a lot. You can see land use conversion shrink, forest sequestration increases. So we are getting there. And yet often the conversation stops here. We'll do better agricultural practices and we'll stop cutting down our trees. This is not going to reach our net zero target. For one, we still have this huge slice of enteric fermentation. Two, that's really the big one. We still have a lot of activity going on. So let's try something completely different. You notice here Latin America is producing more and more and more. What if we avoided what we call excess production? So I'm going to switch over here. In the baseline, Latin America is producing, ends up nearly doubling its livestock head. What if we tapered that off such that all domestic demand is met and additional exports are avoided? So if we were exporting historically 10 cows, we're going to stick to 10 cows, even if we could export 12. We reduce our production to meet domestic demand and historical levels of exports. That's what we're going to look at the effect here. Okay, big time difference. That makes a really big difference if we pare back and we make a trade-off between how much we could theoretically produce and how much we will produce to meet climate objectives. And yet we are still not at net zero. We still have this big chunk of enteric fermentation. And where's it coming from? It's coming because of what we like to eat, what people like to eat. There's no way of completely transforming a cow's biology. So what if, in this case, people in Latin America chose to have a different diet? And in fact, a healthier diet, right? Rates of obesity are unfortunately astronomical. What would that look like? It makes a difference. It doesn't transform everything, but it makes it's a huge tool here. This particular change is a modest decrease in the amount of beef and meat that's consumed. Clearly, no one thing is going to get us there, but there's good news. It's hard to see here, and I'm going to show a different plot, but what if we threw the books at it? What if we did all of the things I have mentioned? Here, is what this graph looks like when we net out the impact of forests. We're almost there. We are very close to the 90%. We could do more. We could further decrease consumption of beef. We could further limit productivity. No, sorry, further limit how much is produced in excess. We could reduce food waste. But now we are getting somewhere. That was a lot to take in, so let me summarize what I'm showing you. First is that improving agricultural practices has a limited impact on reaching net zero. It's important, but it is not going to cut it, literally. Protecting what remains of Latin America's forests is absolutely necessary. It's a critical carbon sink, but it's not sufficient as many people are hoping. A lot of people are putting their money on afforestation, and I didn't focus on this. Afforestation, which is basically replanting, has unfortunately modest or limited potential because the sequestration capacity of secondary forests is not nearly as much as primary forests. So yes, afforestation will help, but we have to protect what's already there first. And the third thing, the last thing is a toughie. We have to reduce how much beef we consume. The biology of cows is not working for a climate goal. Our current rate of consumption is incompatible with a net zero future. So this is me in Yosemite, but also to say that with these projects, which I love, I have gone off the beaten path, I would say. Let me go back to this question of how I got from that path to this path. I started taking classes in engineering and public policy, which is a different department at CMU. I worked with Tony. I learned about RAND. Tony helped me make connections there. I showed up. I knocked on a lot of people's doors. I demanded to be let in, and I wouldn't take no for an answer. And I've taken a lot of risks. I had a great offer from Google when I graduated from the RI. And it was really scary to turn down the offer that all my friends were accepting in favor of this unknown where I knew no one to go to RAND. But these are the things that allowed me to get on the beaten track. These are some of the choices I made. That's not going to work for everybody, but here's some things I have learned. First, let me talk about why is a robotics degree an asset in these fields? One is that I think at the RI with a robotics degree, you're already working probably on some really wicked, intractable problems and trying to make them tractable in some way. That actually takes a kind of emotional courage to say, yeah, we can do this, or I'm willing to try. I'm not scared of this problem. The second is that none of the methods I've shown you are going to get you, salivating. They're pretty basic things. They're interesting and insightful when applied to these other fields, but they're not revolutionary as far as robotics is concerned. So I think having a robotics degree, you have a capability that many other people, the fact is they don't. I think what also comes from being an outsider is curiosity. I don't know anything about, or I didn't know anything about criminal justice before I worked on this project. And so I asked a lot of questions that challenged the mythology of the field, that people who had been steeped in it took for granted. But I was like, well, what is that? Sometimes my questions were just naive, but sometimes they hit on something that was a blind spot. And I think being an outsider allows you to have curiosity that is new, that is very interesting. And finally, I think having a robotics degree confers some credibility. This is an incredible pedigree. When you're at the RI, everybody has a robotics degree from Carnegie Mellon, but the second you leave, that's a very special thing that you have. And I think people look at it. I have found people go, whoa, and I didn't think of it as whoa, but in the outside world, it is. And when you put it together, all of these characteristics to me have opened opportunities, created opportunities, and allowed me to have impact in places that I didn't think I could. I had no idea 20 years ago that I could have done these things. So let me fulfill a little more of my promise to you. Here are some actions that I think you can take. One is if you're interested in something else, broaden your skills. You are at a world-class university right now with departments and faculty that do everything. Go take some classes, talk to people, collaborate, get out. And it doesn't mean you have to commit to that field, but this is a perfect place to learn new things. My second suggestion is to show up, especially at a time when, people are texting and no one wants to pick up the phone. I have shown up, literally shown up at someone's office and said, hey, I'd really like a job. And I'm right there. So because of all the tools that we have to not avoid human connection, if you invest in human connection, that will set you apart. People are willing to give chances to people, especially if they're standing right at their door. I encourage you to take risks, especially early on in your career, for two reasons. One is this is a time when you may have more freedom, freedom to move around the country, freedom to try different jobs, have different financial situations. And you also may not have yet a long career history that pigeonholes you into looking like a person who does X. So early in your career is a fantastic time to take risks if you can afford to. And the final thing maybe should have been the first thing, which is to define what matters to you. In every community, there is an idea of what matters to the community. Within that, I think it's important to define what matters to you as an individual. And that can be anything, but whatever it is, knowing what matters to you and knowing the extent to which it aligns or misaligns with the people around you can help you chart your own path, whatever that may be. But it's not all roses. So the benefits I have found from this off the beaten path is a tremendous amount of life satisfaction. I find myself very committed to my work, motivated by my work, even as I'm depressed by it. I can't promise that for everyone. Results may vary. That's been my observation. I have also incurred some costs. One is I've lost connection with my field of training. Not just I've lost connection with people because I don't meet at conferences, we don't co-author papers together. I also have no robotics expertise anymore. I have other expertise that I love, but I can't do the things I used to do because I'm out of practice. I haven't needed to use a lot of those skills, methodologies, algorithms. At the same time, I have outsider status in a lot of these fields because I'm not trained in climate change. I'm forever Googling, like, what is an internal rate of return? So there's a lot of discomfort of not belonging sometimes, but that can be okay. And the third is, in not taking a tech job, I earn less money than I could have, but that's okay. I have found that once my needs and my family's needs are met, this life satisfaction overshadows whatever else I could buy with a little more money. That's not for everyone, but that's been what I've seen. And I want to be totally explicit about what we're looking at here. So let me close with two thoughts. One is, I hope you can come to see your robotics degree as essentially a jetpack for your career. Everybody has that. Use it, enjoy it, see where it takes you, see what kinds of leaps and bounds you can make. And the second, please eat less beef, seriously. Thank you. Any questions? It's very quiet.
I think there's a couple of hands. Victoria?
Yeah, I'm on Zoom. I have a question. I actually have two questions, if that's okay.
Hey.
This was a great talk. This was really exciting, and it's cool to see non-robotics applications. So my first talk is about the climate part. One of the mitigation strategies you mentioned is let's reduce the amount of excess cows that are being exported. And I'm curious, that seems to sort of ignore the externalities of the emissions from other countries. If we're reducing the amount of cows that we're exporting, are those countries just gonna breed more cows?
That's a great question. And the term for that is leakage, right? If you have a policy here, will it has an effect within its boundaries, but then causes leakage that's offset. That is absolutely a concern. And so it is not the case that one country can stop producing beef and then everything's glorious. Somebody else will see an opportunity and will absolutely fill in that hole, which is all the more reason why having a meat-intensive diet, especially a ruminant-intensive diet anywhere, is problematic. And that question is also what makes it hard for anyone to take individual action. If you imagine like Argentina says, okay, we're not going to make this beef, right? I think their constituents would very realistically be like, great, we're just going to hurt ourselves, while Chile next door is going to ramp up their production and meet that unmet demand. This is why consumer choice is actually much more powerful than government regulation, because we get to say every single day, 3 times a day, what we want on our plates. And that you can't change. That doesn't cross boundaries.
Thanks.
The
And
second
then-
question.
Yeah, my second question is about the first part of the talk on the recidivism prediction.
Mhm.
So the main application you were talking about for these prediction models was hiring, but I'm curious what the pros and cons might be, or if you might need to rework these models if you wanted to use it for other applications, like choosing the strictness of people's parole or something like that.
Yeah, those would be different because particularly decisions around like pretrial detention, parole, those are framed in the criminal justice timeline, which says, what do we need to do when we release a person, or should we release a person? The same, it's not clear to me that the principle applies, because there isn't that, we don't have missing information. The problem in the background check is that there is this information between release and check that the system is ignoring. But when we're talking about, again, these kinds of criminal justice decisions, there isn't that information. We're at the start of that release point. And your question makes me want to say too, that we're very cautious about being flippant about the systemic biases in the existing system, which can be then baked in. And I don't want to blow past that point at all, because that's a real risk anytime you take, human-centered decisions and then build, an algorithm to do it instead. Our hope is that we can do background checks better, at least, than we're currently doing them, even if we haven't solved every problem that exists with them. More questions?
Hi, Nidhi. I had one question, especially on the second project. So in the analysis that you presented, have we accounted for like how likely are policy decisions in these different areas going to succeed? So for example, asking a country to reduce its exports for beef on paper seems well, but that's going to result in loss of economy for that country, and how likely are they going to adapt? Another thing being like, yes, adoption in diet is a very good strategy, but like organizations like PETA have been advocating it for like 40 years, but even then it seems like meat productions are still going up. So how do we account for?
So those are 2 questions, or I'll answer them separately. One is on the question of policy effectiveness. So this particular project focuses on what needs to happen. There's not exactly how likely, but what would occur if it didn't happen, if we can't reduce production. There's a separate project the IDB is undertaking, which says what policies are going to get us there. Like, what will be the uptake of a subsidy? What if we had a tax on cows? What if we, and then follow-on projects for us are going to be looking at the fiscal impacts. So we aren't answering every question. That question of how, but we are trying to influence the question of what's effective. Because a lot of resistance to climate mitigation is under this view that it's going to really stink for us. Like, we're going to have to sacrifice a lot. Sometimes that's true. If you love your carnitas, like, that's going to be really hard. But for a lot of things, it's actually really good. For the Ministry of Health, eating less beef is enormous savings. For the transportation industry, electrification can have enormous savings. Bus rapid transit can have enormous benefits that have nothing to do with climate change. So we're trying to shift the conversation to things that matter to the people who ultimately have to make those sacrifices. On your second question of PETA, this is a problem that I think PETA is looking at this from an ethics, animal rights standpoint, and I respect that. But few people are going to change their minds if what they're told is you're being bad, you're a bad person, bad. Instead, I think the answer needs to be, what do you say about reducing your beef, replacing with chicken for, like I'm a vegetarian, but that's my choice. But every day, the reason that I spend more than a moment on beef is because first, it is shown to be a persistent, pernicious problem in climate change. But secondly, it's a choice that almost everyone can make and that it benefits people almost all the time. So it's hard. People like what they like, but now today more than ever, we have alternatives, and doing a little, all of us doing a little bit can be more impactful than a few people going all the way. More questions?
If nobody else has one, I have sort of like, you talked a little bit in the beginning about sort of your kind of emotional journey, and like part of it, how like one of the benefits is somewhat intangible, right? And I wanted to kind of ask along those lines a question about what it feels like for you to work on small parts of these very important problems that where impact is not super measurable, or sometimes these problems
Negligible
feel
might
really,
be a word you're looking for.
right. And yeah, like
It's
any thoughts about that?
a lot of thoughts about that. It's really hard. It's really hard to work on this issue that is existential, and know that the most I have done is to write a report about it. This is a really hard field to work in because it's hard to find places of hope. It's hard to keep going. And yet that's the only thing to be done. My alternative is to not work on these issues or to give up. And we're not going to do those things. So, the answer is to have a good therapist. That's really what you need.
Cool.
And you're not working on it alone. There's how many do you work with together as a team on?
I work, depending on the project, dozens of people directly, but then there's an entire universe of people working on the problem. The question that has been coming up is, how much more research do we really need? This is existential to me. How much more research do we really need? We kind of already know what needs to be done, and now it's a communication motivation problem. And at RAND and at many other places, we have this is our mythology, that facts can improve policy. That is hard to believe in sometimes. So I'm not really answering your question, but I guess there's a lot of people questioning what essentially, I do what I can. I'm a researcher. And I tried to be a politician in a way when I went to work for Kamala Harris. That was tough. That was different. There's a lot of people working on this problem, but it actually ultimately requires each of us as individuals to enact and to make choices based on what we see. My research isn't going to change the world. More questions?
Balmain?
I see hands. Tadmek? Yeah.
Hey, yeah. So one thing you alluded to during the talk was this sense of risk at the prospect of jumping away from robotics and into further away fields, both in terms of in terms of a variety of things. I'm curious, can you walk us through how you talked yourself into taking that risk and sort of accepting that you were giving up on, say, things like the familiarity of your previous domain, or I mean, even like the money and so.
Yeah, I had to ask myself, what is it I'm afraid of? I had to be really precise. I found that I was afraid. One, I was afraid of being wrong. What if I went to RAND to try to work on this stuff and I actually didn't care? I hated it. And then robotics wouldn't take me back. I had left and I was the, expunged child. There was that sense of anticipated regret that I was afraid of. But ultimately, I was more afraid of having to show up to work every day, wishing I were somewhere else. And I knew I would be successful at Google, and it would be very financially rewarding at Google, and I would be with the friends I'd already known. But I came down to, if I don't take a chance on myself, who will? There's no other way for me to answer sort of the turmoil inside other than doing. And if it doesn't work out, well, I would sooner bear the regret of a choice taken that didn't work out than the regret of not taking that risk. And that's really what it came down for me. The risk of not trying was scarier than the risk of trying and failing.
Right. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I just want to say I really appreciate this, because this is not something we hear a lot. And it's like really heartening for us to have this perspective. Yeah.
Thank you. And I know we're reaching the end of our time, but I am happy to stay if there are more questions. Otherwise, we can close, and I invite people to email me if they want to talk further, but there is a hand up.
Yeah, so I just have one last question. So you're at a corporation and you're working with governments, and you've also talked a lot about individuals. And then there's also nonprofits that are doing a lot of work in these areas. So I'm curious if you have any overarching thoughts about the interplay between these, or are we overemphasizing the role of one versus another?
No, it requires action at every level, this problem of climate change in particular, because there are some things you as an individual can't do. You can't clean up your own electricity grid. And then there are some things government really can't do for you without being fascist, which is to tell you what to put on your dinner plate. So it requires better and different choices from the individual, from nonprofits, from communities, local, state, federal government, and international government. That's what makes it so hard. I think if there was one thing, just one thing each of us could do, we'd be cool with it. But the problem can at times feel so insurmountable, and we can feel so helpless. I will tell you, this is personal, but I do what I can. The reason that this is a remote visit is because I no longer fly to talk about climate change. That makes no sense. So I do not do business travel anymore, full stop. I'm a vegetarian. I have arguments at home about whether we should fly for any personal travel. These are hard questions. This is my personal place of hope. I know that if people who care about climate change are doing what they can, then I have hope. If people who care about climate change don't do what they can because they're waiting for someone else to take the first step, then I don't have hope. So I make my choices because I want to be hopeful. I don't know if that answers your question. Any other questions?
Awesome. I think we can wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nidhi.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so good to be back. Feel free to shoot me an email, my first name @rand.org, and I definitely hope to hear from some of you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.